Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's discussion on a persistent and often contentious issue, the gender pay gap in professional sports. Is the significant difference in earnings between male and female athletes justified? Joining us are Elena Petrova, a former professional athlete and strong advocate for equal pay, and David Miller, a sports market analyst. Elena argues the gap is fundamentally unjust, while David contends it reflects market realities. We'll begin with opening statements, followed by rebuttals, a moderated discussion, and closing remarks.
Thank you, Sarah. The core issue here is one of fundamental fairness. Athletes, regardless of gender, dedicate their lives to reaching the pinnacle of their sport, demonstrating extraordinary skill, commitment, and resilience. The physical and mental demands are comparable, the sacrifices are equivalent, yet the financial rewards often show a staggering discrepancy. Look at sports like basketball, soccer, or tennis. Even at the highest levels, women frequently earn considerably less than their male counterparts for comparable achievements. This isn't an anomaly. It's a pattern. To suggest this is purely down to the market ignores decades, even centuries, of systemic bias and deliberate underinvestment in women's sports. Women's sports have historically been undervalued, underfunded, and received minimal media exposure compared to men's sports, hindering their commercial growth potential from the outset. This lack of investment and visibility artificially suppresses interest and, consequently, perceived market value. It's a cycle perpetuated by inaction and outdated assumptions about audience appeal. We aren't necessarily demanding identical paychecks in every single instance tomorrow, but we are demanding that pay structures genuinely reflect athletic achievement, effort, and contribution, not gender. It's about acknowledging the inherent worth and marketability of female athletes and providing the resources, platforms, and promotion necessary for their sports to flourish commercially, just as men's sports have benefited from for generations. Equal opportunity must extend to economic recognition and reward. The current gap is not merely a passive reflection of the market. It is an active reflection of persistent inequality and a failure to value women athletes appropriately.
Thank you, Sarah. Elena raises important points about dedication and skill which are undeniably present at the elite level across genders. However, the economic landscape of professional sport is complex and largely driven by quantifiable market forces, audience engagement, and revenue generation, not solely by sentiment or principles of fairness detached from financial realities. Salaries in professional sports are intrinsically linked to the revenue streams associated with the athletes, their teams, and their leagues. We must look objectively at the financial figures involved. In many major global sports, men's leagues and tournaments currently generate substantially higher revenues. This includes income from ticket sales, the value of broadcast rights deals, merchandise sales, and corporate sponsorships. For instance, the global television rights for the Men's FIFA World Cup are valued exponentially higher than those for the Women's World Cup. This reflects a larger established global audience and, therefore, higher advertising income potential. Similarly, average viewership figures for regular season games in well-established men's leagues, like the NBA or the major European football leagues, demonstrate a significant disparity compared to their female counterparts like the WNBA or the WSL, impacting advertising revenue and the value of broadcast contracts. Sponsors and advertisers, logically, allocate their significant budgets based on reach, audience demographics, and expected return on investment. They naturally invest more heavily where the largest and most engaged audiences currently reside. This isn't necessarily intended as a judgment on the quality or excitement of women's sports, but it represents a pragmatic business decision based on current, measurable market conditions and commercial returns. Therefore, the observed pay gap often directly reflects this difference in commercial value and the overall financial ecosystem supporting the specific sport or league. Higher revenue allows for higher operating budgets, including player salaries. It's less about intentional gender discrimination within the pay structures themselves and more about the economic realities that dictate financial flows and compensation levels within the highly competitive sports industry. Pay tends to correlate strongly with the revenue an athlete or their league demonstrably helps generate.
David presents a very neat, clinical picture of market forces, but it conveniently overlooks why those revenue figures and viewership numbers differ so starkly in the first place. He mentions lower viewership and broadcast rights for women's sports, but how can they realistically achieve comparable figures without first receiving comparable investment, consistent media airtime on major platforms, and serious promotional backing? It's a classic chicken and egg scenario, perpetuated by neglect. You cannot accurately gauge the true market potential or audience appetite for women's sports if they are consistently underfunded, underpromoted, and relegated to secondary channels or inconvenient time slots. Consider the tangible growth when investment is made. The recent surge in interest and attendance in women's soccer in England following increased backing by the FA and broadcasters, or the documented growth of the WNBA audience when games are consistently promoted and aired on accessible networks. Revenue doesn't just magically appear out of thin air. It follows strategic investment, sustained visibility, and dedicated promotion. To simply accept the current market value as an unchangeable fact ignores the historical disadvantages and conscious or unconscious biases that have actively shaped it over many years. Blaming the gap solely on current revenue conveniently absolves governing bodies, sponsors, and media outlets of their crucial role and responsibility in creating and nurturing that revenue potential for women's sports.
Elena speaks passionately about potential and the impact of investment, and I certainly agree that women's sports are demonstrating exciting growth, which is beneficial for the entire sports ecosystem. However, potential and current economic reality are two different things when it comes to financial planning and large-scale investment decisions. Investment decisions by broadcasters and major sponsors are primarily based on proven performance, predictable audience numbers, and quantifiable returns, not just on future potential or social objectives alone. While strategic investment can undoubtedly stimulate growth, as Elena rightly pointed out with her examples, there's a practical limit to how much audience demand can be artificially generated or accelerated if the broad, organic consumer base isn't yet comparable in scale to long-established men's leagues. Broadcasters paid billions for rights to leagues like the Premier League or the NFL because decades of data guarantee consistent mass viewership, ensuring substantial advertising revenue. That same level of financial certainty and scale doesn't yet exist for many women's leagues, hence the understandable caution and lower valuations in rights negotiations. It's not about deliberately suppressing potential. It's about prudent financial risk management and allocating finite resources based on current tangible audience engagement metrics and expected commercial returns within a competitive marketplace. The market takes first undoubtedly shaped by history, as Elena noted. But businesses, broadcasters, and sponsors must operate viably in the present economic climate. Closing the pay gap sustainably requires continued, organic growth in viewership, participation, and commercial revenue for women's sports, which inevitably takes time and cannot be instantly manufactured.
David, Elena strongly argues that the lower revenue you frequently cite is itself a direct consequence of decades of underinvestment and a lack of consistent media focus compared to men's sports. How do you respond specifically to the idea that the, quote, market itself is inherently skewed by these historical factors and therefore not a fair basis for current pay?
I acknowledge the historical context, Sarah, absolutely. Decades ago, the investment wasn't there. But even with the increased investment we see today, translating that into revenue parity requires a monumental shift in broad consumer behavior, media consumption habits, and corporate sponsorship priorities on a global scale. This shift is happening, albeit gradually in many areas. However, attempting to enforce strict pay parity before Mansarn revenue parity is achieved carries significant financial risks. It could potentially bankrupt leagues, deter crucial external investment if the returns aren't demonstrably there, or lead to job losses within the sport.
Elena, turning to you, David raises the critical point about financial viability and risk. Given the current, often substantial revenue differences he highlights, what practical, actionable steps can governing bodies or leagues realistically take right now to meaningfully bridge the gap without jeopardizing the financial stability of women's leagues or teams?
It absolutely requires a proactive, multi-pronged strategy, Sarah, not just passive acceptance of the status quo. Governing bodies must take a leadership role, mandate fairer distribution models for centrally generated revenues, ring-fence funds for strategic investment in marketing specifically for women's sports, and invest heavily in grassroots development to build the future player and fan base. Media rights should be bundled cleverly to increase exposure, not just sold off cheaply. Sponsors need to be challenged and encouraged to see the long-term value, the positive brand association, and the significant growth potential in women's sports, rather than just focusing on historical figures or outdated demographic assumptions. It's about making a conscious commitment to building equity and value, not just reacting passively to current market numbers. This involves setting clear pathways, targets, and timelines for achieving parity, potentially linking progress to agreed-upon investment and growth metrics, rather than demanding identical sums overnight.
Bundling media rights is an interesting tactic, Elena, but sophisticated buyers will still analyze the package components and attribute value based on perceived audience draw for each part. Mandating redistribution sounds equitable in principle, but if one part of an organization, say men's football, generates 90% of the total revenue, taking a very large chunk to subsidize the other indefinitely isn't a sustainable long-term business model without significant, continuous external funding or a clear, rapid path to commercial self-sufficiency for the women's side.
It's not about indefinite subsidy, David. It's about corrective investment to counteract decades of historical neglect and financial disadvantage. It's about leveling the playing field to unlock the true future commercial value that has been suppressed for so long. We need to break the very cycle of underinvestment, leading to lower revenue that you yourself described earlier. In conclusion, the argument that the gender pay gap in sports is simply an unavoidable reflection of neutral market forces is an oversimplification, one that conveniently ignores deep-rooted systemic biases and historical inequalities. The extraordinary skill, unwavering dedication, and the fundamental essence of elite athletic achievement are not gendered characteristics. They deserve comparable recognition. The significant pay discrepancies we witness are largely the predictable result of decades of unequal opportunities, chronic underinvestment, insufficient and inconsistent media coverage, and lower promotional budgets afforded to female athletes and their sports. We must actively choose to invest in fairness. We must promote women's sports with the same creativity, resources, and vigor as men's sports. We must structure compensation systems that genuinely value athletic contribution and potential, not just historical revenue streams built on past privilege. Closing the gap is not merely an economic challenge to be solved with strategic vision. It represents a fundamental moral imperative for achieving true equality and respect within the world of sport.
To summarize my position, while the passion, skill, and dedication of female athletes are undeniable, and the growth trajectory of women's sports is indeed positive, the current gender pay gap remains predominantly rooted in significant, objective differences in revenue generation and market demand across many sports. These are tangible economic factors: viewership figures, ticket sales volumes, media rights valuations, sponsorship investments that directly shape the financial landscape and capabilities of professional sports leagues and organizations. Compensation levels inevitably correlate strongly with demonstrable commercial value. While increased investment can certainly foster and accelerate growth in women's sports, Artificially imposing pay parity significantly ahead of underlying revenue parity introduces substantial financial risks that could undermine stability and long-term development. As women's sports continue to successfully grow their audience share, commercial footprint, and overall revenue streams, which I believe they will, the pay gap will naturally and sustainably narrow. However, this evolution must primarily be driven by robust, organic market growth, not solely by mandates that ignore or override fundamental economic realities.
Thank you both, Elena Petrova and David Miller, for a thorough, insightful, and spirited debate on this incredibly complex and important issue. Thank you to our audience for joining